and Liam. I think Alyssa's, you're going to come up together?
Yes. Tag team.
It's kind of like a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Oh, so you get 20 minutes.
Oh, do we?
Yeah. I'm counting.
Thank you. I'm going to be doing an introduction. Alyssa's going to present data from a Victorian research project we did, and then I'm going to come back at the end. What I want to do is I want to start with some of the frameworks that we use at GLHV. Now, we're an LGBTI health and policy unit, and we sit within an academic setting. And we've done a lot of work, and I'll come back to some questions at the end of this presentation about what organisations might be able to do to demonstrate in advance that they're LGBTI inclusive. The frameworks we use, which very much drove the research but drives the work we do at GLHV, is to make a very basic distinction between equality and equity. There's a lot of discussion around equality, and the idea is that you give everybody the same, and you treat everybody the same. But as you can see from the diagram with the boxes, if you give everybody the same box, for some people that still will not give them an equality of outcome. Sometimes you need to rearrange the boxes. And that's the distinction we made between equality and equity. Equality really overlaps with a lot of the discussion we found in the research, whether it's in the emergency management sector or a number of other sectors we work, where people always start when we talk about LGBTI people with, we treat everybody the same. And we argue that no, sometimes you need to rearrange the boxes, and you don't treat everybody the same, and until you rearrange the boxes, people don't have equity of outcomes. One of the frameworks that we use again, and I think Maureen said in her opening that discrimination in the everyday absolutely comes into emergency management services, it comes into everything. The sorts of discrimination that LGBTI people experience systemically is actually reflected obviously in the sorts of services we access. So we talk about two forms of discrimination that LGBTI people face. We call the first one direct, and that's just reduced physical and mental health and well-being, social disadvantage and economic disadvantage, but there are also indirect effects. And for many LGBTI people, the data shows that we're very unwilling to access mainstream services because of an expectation or a past experience of discrimination. And in a way, that's an indirect consequence of that broader discrimination. And I want to take you through some of the data, again making Maureen's point, that what we want to talk about in the project is the way in which broader forms of discrimination against LGBTI people lead to very particular sets of issues in the emergency management response. So if I go back to the first of those and just give you some very basic data that we hold at GLHV, we know from a national survey that 65% of trans and gender diverse people had experienced discrimination or harassment, and that was a national survey of 1,000 people, and that's a recent survey. In Victoria, in an earlier survey, we discovered that 1 in 7 LGBT people reported living in fear of what I call heterosexist violence. That's violence against them because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their intersex variation. And we know that nearly 26% of GLBT people report being subject to heterosexist verbal abuse, 16% to harassment, and 15% to physical violence or the threat of physical violence because they're LGBT. Other direct effects of that sort of systemic violence, LGBT people are up to 14 times more likely to attempt suicide or self-harm than the national averages, and nearly 21% of transgender respondents in our national survey reported suicide ideation compared to 2.3% in the in the general population. And the final one, just as a little bit like Dale was doing, it's a bit of a Cook's tour of really much more detailed data sets. We know that use of illicit drugs in the LGBT community is 2 to 5 times higher than in the general population, and that's a survey that we led called A Closer Look, which was a survey of LGBT Australians, 4,000 respondents. And we know from a national survey that sits in the research centre I'm part of young people, that nearly 8% of young people who identified as same-sex attracted had injected drugs compared to 1.3% of young people who are opposite-sex attracted. So these are a direct representation of the effects of direct discrimination on the health and well-being of LGBT people. Some of the indirect effects, which I want to link to accessing and using services, we know from our national surveys that 44% of LGBT respondents, and in our survey they were 16 to 89 years, reported that they occasionally or usually hid their sexual or gender identity in public. the fear of discrimination and abuse. And one of the things we say in our training is your sexuality, your gender identity, your intersex variation is not something that can be deveined like a prawn. It's absolutely a constitutive part of your humanity. And I'd like you to reflect what it would mean to anyone in the room, including people who are LGBT. I make no assumption that the people in the room here identify as cisgender and heterosexual. But what would it mean in your work situation where you work 50 hours a week, when you're in the cafeteria, when you're talking with friends, where you cannot talk about an absolutely fundamental part of who you are? That is an indirect effect of heterosexist discrimination. We know that nearly 34% of LGBT Australians usually or occasionally hid their sexuality or gender identity when accessing services. A huge issue, obviously, when we're talking about emergency management, when these populations are experiencing increased vulnerability. And 84% of LGBT people who participated in mainstream sport are not out. Another way in which you're hiding a fundamental part of who you are, which other people don't even think about. The other final thing I want to say about indirect is that LGBT people underutilise services, partly because they've had past experiences that are discriminatory, or they anticipate from new services. And given that background data, that anticipation is perfectly reasonable and explicable. And that leads, of course, to a poorer prognosis from everything from physical to mental health conditions if you're presenting much later when you're absolutely in crisis. We know that sexual minority women in Australia actually use GPs more than heterosexual women, but they have really poor continuity of care because they're going shopping around from one GP to another, and when people aren't responsive, they go on to the next one. And one of the major indicators of good quality GP care is continuity of care. So that's an indirect effect. And I want to say that identity concealment can lead to a significant reduction in quality of care, particularly for services where letting somebody know your gender identity or sexual orientation or intersex variation is crucial. But even not, the minute you feel that level of discomfort where you can't disclose, you're going to get a reduced quality of care.
So I'll be talking about a report that, along with Liam and my organisation at Women's Health in the North, as part of the Gender and Disaster Pod, were commissioned to produce a report about identifying the vulnerabilities and needs of LGBTI groups during disasters in the Victorian context. So this comprised of two surveys, one of LGBTI people who had gone through disasters and their experience with emergency service organisations, and surveys of emergency management personnel and their attitudes towards LGBTI people and what kind of needs they might need or what they understood their needs to be during an emergency. Positively, one of the main findings of the report was that 42% of emergency management personnel were very supportive of understanding the needs of LGBTI people during disasters. It shows that there is many people who do want to learn more, and this was the grounding of our report of what we want to take forward, in that there is a strong desire for change and that there is a strong desire to make sure that the service is welcoming and can be approached by all depending on whatever need you have during an emergency when you are most vulnerable. And there were great examples of people who talked about their organisation where leaders did not allow any sort of homophobic comments or transphobic comments, making the space feel very safe for them, and that this was led by their leaders and that they were very proud of that in their organisation. However, there was also other sides to that, in that other people did not have the same experience. One of the respondents was was a lesbian who was a member of a brigade, and said that when she tried to sign up for the brigade, in the time that the 3-hour orientation session she'd heard a sexist comment, a homophobic comment, and a glorification of violence, where to incite the volunteers to get excited about emergency management, they watched a slow motion boxing fight, in which would incite them to be very excited to fight fires. And this in itself made her feel like it was not a welcoming space, and she never went back to the brigade again. Another member talked about feeling like their sexuality was a risk in the organisation, and that exposing that would make them feel very unsafe, so they did not disclose, as they'd heard such comments in the organisation before, which made them feel like they were vulnerable. This was supported by the emergency management respondents as well, where one in 5 were aware of discrimination in their service against LGBTI people. 1 in 3 had observed remarks that were homophobic or transphobic in nature from their colleagues. And 1 in 4 homophobic attitudes were expressed by individuals but not counted by staff when they were expressed. There was about 1 in 3, so 30% of the emergency management respondents said they did have concerns about what kind of service they were providing to LGBTI people, along with 50% saying that they believe that their organisation addressed the needs of LGBTI people, meaning that the other 50% believe that they didn't address the needs. So it shows there is a high spectrum of responses. This graph in particular shows that there was an equal division between people who believe that LGBTI people might face more barriers in a disaster to accessing services than those that don't. There was an equal division there, but there's also a large portion, another 30%, that didn't understand what the needs would be, or didn't know if there would be more barriers for LGBTI people during disasters, which was a common response in the survey, that people just didn't know what the needs of LGBTI people would be. So they found it hard to comment on whether their service would be able to provide good service for LGBTI people, as they didn't know what the needs would be or what they could do to help LGBTI people feel more welcoming coming to the survey. So that lack of information came through quite strongly, that they wanted to understand more in most cases. Now, if we look at what happens in disaster, so this is looking at the results from the EM personnel and the LGBTI respondents of what happens in the actual disaster. So 1 in 3 emergency management personnel don't believe that you can protect your privacy during an emergency. There's no way to do that. And 1 in 3 believe that LGBTI people tend to look after themselves in emergency and don't need formal services to help them out. And 70% believe that everyone pulls together in an emergency and supports each other, which I think is indicative of actually probably what happens, in that 70% probably do pull together and are part of this heteronormative idea and can fit into the services and feel safe going to all services because you're part of the norm, while that 30% do not believe that you pull together, and that there are those who are excluded from those services and might not feel safe coming forward and might not be part of the community that pulls together after an emergency because for any reason they don't feel safe in that space, or have felt excluded in some instance or another. Echoing some stuff that Dale has talked about, the loss of privacy, these are just certain things we pull out from the report, but one that came up a lot was the lack of privacy after emergencies. So I mentioned the lesbian woman who hadn't come out to her brigade before. After the fires of Black Saturday, it came out because there was no privacy. Her partner had to go to the shelter and she couldn't hide it that she had a female partner. And after that came out to her brigade, she said there was a large amount of bullying and harassment that started to happen within the community, but also within her brigade, leading eventually to her leaving that brigade and going to another community to be part of that brigade, which she also ended up leaving because of the harassment continued into the next brigade until she came closer to Melbourne and found a brigade that was a lot more welcoming, but she had to move twice to find that. Another respondent, we've named them Stevie in the report here, they were out in the community. People knew that they were a lesbian couple, but after the fires, they felt a lot more isolated. She talked a lot about the community coming together, and in those events, it wasn't welcoming. They did not feel it was welcoming to LGBTI people because parts of the community were invited, but those kind of comments, homophobic comments, were repeated in these events, and once they heard them, they felt a lot more isolated, and they felt that they were actually more isolated in their community after the fires, and that they weren't part of that 70% that did pull together. Attitudes that came up a lot in the report that Liam touched on is everyone is the same. Why should we have to cater our services to LGBTI people? Because we have a singular service, it's the same for everyone. We don't care what colour you are, what sexual orientation you have. We provide a service, it will help you, and we don't need to tailor our services to anyone's special needs or vulnerabilities. I thought one of our respondents captured this beautifully. When you say this, you're dismissing anyone's concerns that they have about the service, not even welcoming that conversation to be had about how they could be more welcoming. This attitude of everyone is the same comes from a position without having lots of information about the topic, I think, because 75% of the respondents, so 3 in 4 people, had never had any training on LGBTI people's experiences during disasters or any sort of needs they might have. So saying that this service is the same for everyone and that's okay comes from a position without having that knowledge background, and that's what this kind of report we hope will go towards in informing that basis that you need to have this, you need to tailor your service in a way that can be welcoming for everyone, and I think the first step is understanding what differences someone might have during an emergency that's different to your experience. So this is an example of the kind of attitudes that we came across where it's seen as, what they've said is gender and sexuality is irrelevant as skin colour or religion. We work compassionately, tirelessly and professionally on any and all people, which is true. The EM personnel work very tirelessly to help the community, and they're often part of it themselves. But it doesn't acknowledge that there may be people who are not accessing services they don't hear about, or they are hiding parts of their lives that they don't feel safe to disclose, and that conversation is never opened or even be able to have, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to open that discussion with someone who's saying this. Taking a quote from Gay and Lesbian Health Victoria, treating everybody the same usually means that all people are treated as heterosexual and cisgender, and can be alienating to those people who don't identify within those groups. LGBTI people have different life experiences and health needs from their heterosexual and cisgender partners, and that needs to be understood. Just picking out parts of other things that had influenced the LGBTI respondents' experience during disasters was the influence of language. Certain language really was the main crux of people not feeling welcome in these services or feeling like they couldn't disclose to certain groups. Language that people often say is just a joke, take it lightly, what are you worried about, it's just a joke. That it never is just a joke, it always contributes to someone feeling safe in that space. And that understanding that is a first step of at least opening the discussion of what people want to talk about. Or another respondent talked about when she went to the table to create a fire plan, and the first question was, well, where will your husband be? What's your husband going to be doing? Is he going to be fighting the fire? And then she would have to come out. And this is what happens every time she speaks to emergency service, that she has to come out and say, no, there's no male partner here, it's me and my partner, who's a female. And having to come out each and every time and watching their reaction to that, and having to deal with their reaction almost as a burden to her, to have to make them feel okay that they haven't insulted her and that she's okay. And that is tirelessly happening in an emergency when there's hundreds of new people in the community and you need to try and get some sort of help for your family. You don't want to be having to deal with having to come out, and you want to know that the organisation is welcoming of you and safe and tailored to any sort of need that you might have. So that's what she was, that's the example I was giving you about when she was creating the fire plan, and she said that made her feel very isolated in the community and that she wasn't part of the norm that they were expecting to help, and they obviously had no concept that they'd be helping any LGBTI people and didn't feel like they were willing to consider that. As I've discussed about always needing to come out with the different services and the reaction you get there. We put together a word cloud of the different words that people, LGBTI respondents particularly, used when they were talking about their experiences during disaster. And the one thing that stood out was shared, and this is a shared experience. And as I said, lots of these EM personnel are part of the community themselves, and creating that space in the community where they feel safe to come out and they feel welcome despite their sexuality, feeling that they are part of the norm, they are part of the community, and they are as welcome as every other member, and that they are safe to talk to any emergency service personnel about what services they might need, or that they don't feel like their privacy is being invaded, so that they can experience emergency as anyone else would and go to the services afterwards that they need. So that shared experience was a really key point that came out from the LGBTI responses. 42% of the EM respondents committed to taking training or understanding the needs of LGBTI people in order to create a more welcoming environment. However, there was hostility in response to the report. Overall, it was a positive or at least neutral response. but there was a small portion that expressed quite strong hostility in reaction to the report. Again, talking about we need to spend our money on more important things, and that we need to spend money on things that will help all of the community, not just a small part as the LGBTI group as they saw it were. And I think that demonstrates the barriers that we might still face in this space about making people understand that the expectations on emergency services aren't necessarily that you tailor an individual service for every single group that might be out there, but at least making the space feel welcoming so that if you did have any concerns that you wanted to raise with emergency service, you feel safe to do so during an emergency. So I might leave the recommendations and a bit more of the reaction to the report to Liam.
Perfect. Thanks.
Please just read the recommendations. For those of you who want a copy of the report, there may be some hard copies available, and at some stage it will actually be on a PDF version. So they're very sensible. Source and offer training, review policies and practices, consider measures to increase LGBTI people's participation, demonstrate organisational commitment and assist in building resilience among LGBTI communities. They're the major recommendations of the report. One of the final things, and I will hurry because I know we're behind, is that for all of the positives, there was some really, really overt homophobic and transphobic hostility, and it's worth acknowledging that. So the sooner you let it drop and stop trying to make yourselves out as victims, that's LGBTI people or different, the sooner your problems will disappear, and you can read the rest of that quote. Why we have to pedestal these groups, that's LGBTI people, is beyond normal comprehensions. Indicative of the extreme negativity, but it's a hostility that I think was reflected when the survey was tweeted by Craig Lapsley. For those of you who don't know, when we designed the distribution strategy, Craig, very demonstrating leadership very sensibly, put it out on his tweet. I put the first 3 comments, which started to get increasingly homophobic and transphobic. As Craig will tell you, by the 200th comment, they were vile. And I'm here to tell you, as the person who developed, along with Ros Ward, the Safe Schools program, that the level of hostility at the moment towards LGBTI people from particular elements, within particular services, but the community at large, is really quite frightening. The Australian chose to then write an editorial in which I was pilloried at the back end, along with a number of people at the front of this stage, for huge first 2-page article. In the second page, you find what they're really doing. So they have Liam Leonard, director of GLHV, of that controversial program Safe Schools. Had nothing to do with this project. This project is a very modest project. And then an editorial a week later, an editorial in the Australian that said, GLHV is putting the lives of Victorians at risk. This is a small, modest project, and if you can sort of unpick all of that, you realise that for all of the positivities, there are some terrible things going on. In response to people's questions about what can we do, at GLHV we've developed a world first called the Rainbow Tick program. It's a form of service accreditation, where services can get formally accredited as part of their 2 or 3 year accreditation cycle against 6 standards for LGBTI inclusivity. There are indicators under each standard, and nationally there are now 20 agencies. The largest is Uniting in New South Wales, which is a faith-based service that deliver aged care services. They got the tick for 130 services, so there is no tension, in our opinion, between faith-based delivery and LGBTI people. That's a furphy. The tick could be used by any emergency management service, but to get it, you have to be accredited, which means that you have to demonstrate that all your systems and processes are LGBTI inclusive. So there's an answer to the question, how can you let people know? They're the 6 standards. That's Banyule City Council, their Asian Disability Services, who got the tick a year ago. They did a beautiful presentation with the Mayor, and that's Alyssa. And I would like to thank all the researchers, Helen, Deb, Sue from DPC, who supported us. Thank you.